I want to say good evening to everyone. Um, we're so thankful that you have joined us for our 2025 Nannie Helen Burroughs lecture here at Howard University School of Divinity. Thankful for those who are joining us virtually, streaming with us here from Dumbarton Chapel at 2900 Van Ness Street Northwest. We are so pleased to have as our lecturer this year the Reverend Melanie Jones Quarles, PhD. Reverend Dr. Quarles will give her a more formal introduction in a few minutes, but I want to invite Dean Kenyatta Gilbert to come now and welcome us, and then I will come back with a statement of the occasion.
Greetings, beloved community. It's so wonderful to see you tonight, and for those of you who are joining us online, it's great that you are tuning in for what I believe will be a very, very exciting event tonight. Thank you for attending, and we anticipate that others will join us shortly. But we want to welcome you to our intellectual village, where we are seeking to lead with head and heart, endeavoring to advance excellence in Black theological education and building beloved community together. We welcome you to this wonderful semester, spring semester event. We've not had one like this in quite some time, but we're grateful that we are hosting this in an important month that we recognize our women who are both religious leaders, who are academicians and scholars and visionary educators. And so we're grateful to commemorate and celebrate the life of Dr. Nannie Helen Burroughs tonight. This lecture was originally named the Feminine in Religion lecture, and has since, I guess since 2009, has taken on this name, I would say very appropriately. So honoring the legacy of Dr. Burroughs as minister, visionary educator, suffragist, race woman, Baptist, daughter of the Baptist Church, a woman who made her way in the world, coming here with $1.50 on her person. Today, that would be about $57.04. She established Black-owned, female-operated school when Howard University was a mere 42 years old. A native Virginian transplant who relocated here to begin her pioneering work as an educator and activist, labor leader. I want you to sort of think about that for a moment. Howard was 42. She came here with $1.50. In what is now the most heavily gentrified city. I think that's amazing, and we are her legacy. I'm working on 2 projects on the life of King, and there is no shortage of work on Dr. King, as you know, but only in recent years has scholarship risen to a level that will inspire others, I believe, to continue to write and to investigate and examine the life of Dr. Burroughs, only in recent years. But you're here tonight to honor her, recognize her, and we are also very pleased to see some of our esteemed scholars in our midst. I want to give thanks to our administrative team, who's hospitably welcomed our guest lecturer tonight. Thank you. Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles, for gracing us with your presence. Not only are you brilliant, you are a capable leader, and you are a daughter of the Black church. And we thank you for the witness that you bring to this moment to share with us tonight. We get a little closer to building beloved community in moments like this, in these challenging and unprecedented times. And so to have a voice with us tonight to give us a word of inspiration, we are indeed grateful. So welcome again, and thank you. God bless.
The Reverend Melanie Jones Quarles, PhD, is a womanist ethicist, a millennial preacher, and an intellectual activist. She is Assistant Professor of Ethics, Theology, and Culture, and the inaugural Director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. Formerly, Melanie served as the first Crump Visiting Professor and Black Religious Scholar in Residence at Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas, and lecturer at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas, American Baptist College in Nashville, Tennessee, at Chicago Theological Seminary, and the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Economics and Political Science from Howard University, and a Master of Divinity with a certificate in Black Church Studies from Vanderbilt University Divinity School. And she earned her Doctor of Philosophy degree in Ethics, Theology, and Culture with a concentration in Black faith and life at Chicago Theological Seminary. Her research engages womanist theological ethics and sacred texts, millennials and faith, Black aesthetics, and digital technocultures. Her first academic monograph is Up Against a Crooked Gospel, Black Women's Bodies and the Politics of Redemption. I'm so pleased to hold this book in my hands. It was just published a few months ago by Orbis Books, and you will have an opportunity at the conclusion of the lecture, she will have a book signing, and you can get a copy of the book. The students who are taking my seminar in Womanist Ethics and Theology, I've told them to bring their books because we are already reading it, already engaging it, and we're just so pleased to have this book in print and to let it serve as a landmark, a milestone of the continuing advancement of womanist ethics and theology. She serves professional societies and international boards as a global leader in Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, where she was formerly the international second vice president. She also has been part of the Black Religious Scholars Group and the Society of Christian Ethics. She is the co-founder of the Millennial Womanism Project and co-host of the Womanist Salon podcast. She was inducted into the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars for her distinguished achievements in April 2024. She is the youngest ordained woman minister at South Suburban Missionary Baptist Church in Harvey, Illinois, a third-generation ordained Baptist preacher and a sought-after lecturer. She is a prophetic millennial voice with noted academic and popular publications and media features on television, radio, and news outlets. She is married to the Reverend Daquan A. Quarles, who is also a Howard alum with a Master of Divinity degree. We are so pleased to have our 2025 Nannie Helen Burroughs Lecture now presented by Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles. Let us celebrate her presence as she comes.
Good evening. I must begin with deep gratitude for the opportunity to share with you this evening. Thank you for this gracious invitation, Dean Gilbert, Dr. Sanders, to the faculty and students of the Howard University School of Divinity. I am indeed honored for this distinct privilege to deliver the 2025 Nannie Helen Burroughs Lecture. I'm humbled because this month, Women's History Month, brings into closer view the contributions of a woman like Nannie Helen Burroughs, the race woman of her time, a Black intellectual, educator, a fine orator, an anti-lynching activist, and founder of Woman's Day, who in her classic speech, How the Sisters Are Hindered from Helping, delivered these words. It has ever been from the time of Miriam, that most remarkable woman, the sister of Moses, that most remarkable man, down to the courageous women that in very recent years have carried the gospel into Tibet and Africa and proclaimed and taught the truth where no man has been allowed to enter. Surely women somehow have had a very important part in this work of saving this redeemed earth, end quote. In other words, Black women are not footnotes to the work of redemption, but primary characters in any iteration of a liberating gospel. It is Nannie Burroughs' righteous discontent, in the words of Black religious historian Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, that fills my fiery tongue as an ordained third-generation Black Baptist woman preacher who belongs to a Black religious tradition that often lags in fully embracing Black women in ministry. I am deeply grateful to my beloved alma mater, Howard University, though I am certain that my womanish proclivities were cultivated during my nascent developmental stages growing up as a young Black preacher's kid in metropolitan Chicago in the late 90s while enduring the back-holding scoldings by my mother to shut my mouth because I was too grown, too fast, and too early. But womanist, as a confessional and scholarly identity, was first intimated as an undergraduate here at Howard University, making Howard a beloved and hallowed sacred ground that nurtured my formation and cultivated my best intellectual ideas. In 2019, I joined Dr. Sanders, Dr. Weems, Dr. Fentress Williams, Dr. Floyd Thomas, and Dr. Pierce to recognize and amplify Howard University School of Divinity as another historically Black theological birthplace of womanist religious thought that is often missing from womanist histories. Thus, it is indeed good to be here again. I am not a graduate of HUSD, but my husband, Reverend Daquan Quarles, is an alum, and for that reason, our family owes a debt of gratitude to this institution. I am joined tonight by my mother, Reverend Dr. Annette Jones, my sister cousin, Tamika Thomaston, my cousin, Carion, who has split some time in his spring break, his HBCU tour to come and be with me on tonight. So thank you. In line with my new book, as Dr. Sanders said, Up Against a Crooked Gospel, Black Women's Bodies and the Politics of Redemption, I've titled tonight's conversation, Bent Towards Justice, Black women's bodies and the problem of salvation in the church and society. In the words of Zora Neale Hurston, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. The womanist paradigm calls us to examine the cultural artifacts of undertold stories by mining the mother lode to excavate hidden figures. In search of my grandmother's gardens, I remember the story deep within the ravines of my ancestral lineage of my grandmother who suffered a bent condition. Sweetie Gertrude Foster was a Black woman raised in the South who served as a domestic worker to white families during her early years in Memphis, Tennessee. After becoming pregnant with my mother, her eldest child, she migrated to Chicago in the 1960s to accompany my grandfather, L.J. Foster. And their decision to start a family and raise children in Chicago meant that she had to forgo her educational endeavors in the early 20s. Dreams of a better life in the urban North deferred quickly because of Chicago's failing labor market and what sociologist William Julius Wilson names as the social deterioration of ghetto neighborhoods in the 60s. Within 10 years of moving to the South Side, the Inglewood neighborhood of Chicago, her second child and firstborn son had died, and her marriage ended in divorce, and she lived as a single mother, raising 2 children while working odd jobs with mediocre pay to make ends meet for her growing family. In the mid-1980s, she found the best available employment for Black women as a room attendant at the downtown Hyatt Regency Hotel, where she worked diligently as a housekeeper for over 20 years before being forced to retire because of debilitating health. For more than a decade, numerous legal cases condemn Hyatt as, quote, the worst employer of the hotel services industry, and particularly Hyatt Regency Chicago for its unfair labor practices, low wages, and increased surveillance of workers. The laborious domestic work of bending to clean floors, making beds, and attend to guests reduced blood flow to her legs, injuring her veins, and eventually osteoporosis in her spine, resulting in the final years of her life slumped over. More than a decade ago, my grandmother died of complications of an enlarged heart. What began as initially a visit to the hospital ultimately ended in her demise. In that moment, I noticed a very peculiar happening. For the first time in 25 years that we could remember, my grandmother's crooked body laid straight. For folks who knew my grandmother, this was a sure sign within moments of her passing that she had encountered in body transformation, because the crookedness of her spine would not allow her to lay her entire body down on her back for many years. I'm certain she was not born with a bent body because of the photographs that reveal her body at multiple stages of her life standing erect. Her spine began to considerably move or shift during my middle school and junior high years, and the crookedness was noticeable just 1 year before her passing at my Divinity School graduation. I know all too well of a woman of great virtue who suffered from a bent body. These images of an erect body, of a bent crooked body, and a restored transformed body bring the memory of my grandmother's bent body, exposing the unbearable weight of the social tragedies of living as a poor migrant, domestic, divorced, Black church woman that ultimately pressed her down. I could not help but notice the eerie correlation between her story and the unnamed woman with a bent condition in Luke 13, 10 and 17. The bent woman in Luke, her narrative parallels with the story of my grandmother and the broader historical and contemporary narratives of the Black female body bent multiple by pervasive historical, social, and religious threats, often seeking to stifle her survival and liberation that is inextricably linked to attacks against Black women's moral agency. In the 1980s, exercising their intellectual agency, Black women religious scholars adapted Alice Walker's four-part poetic framing of the womanist definition and birthed womanism as a critical approach in religious studies to take seriously the lived experiences of struggle and survival of Black women against multiple forces of oppression. Bendedness, in my view, marks not only a physical condition as much as it signals a theological and a moral predicament for Black women. The questions that have shaped my work are not simply personal, but they are theoethical. Who or what contributes to the social phenomenon of Black women's bendedness in body and character? How might Black religion, the Black church, be held responsible or accountable for such a bent condition? And is freedom for Black women possible in life and not in death? The economic and political history of Black women from slavery to freedom begs question of whether a liberating God has concern for Black women. Seeley, the protagonist in Alice Walker's The Color Purple, laments, if he ever listened to poor colored women, the world would be a different place, I can tell you. In Seeley's imagination, the Western archetype of God as big and old and tall and gray-bearded and white inhibits Black women from finding themselves in God's image and in God's care. What must Black women do to be saved? Womanist soteriology emerges at the crossroads of valuations of the body and soul. In a world that seeks to deny Black women's human dignity, the salvation of Black women is the reclamation of our identity, the redemption of our personhood, remembering our stories, the restoration of our bodies, and the recognition of our moral character. It is not the wrongdoing of Black women from which we must be saved, but the wrong done to Black women from oppressive systems and powers in the society, such as the labor force, the American political scene, and most notably, the Black church. Thus, Black women's salvation is both material and immaterial, pointing to liberation from the socio-political, biophysical, and psycho-spiritual forces that ultimately stifle Black women's freedom and flourishing. Such forces implicate both white supremacist, capitalist, heteropatriarchal American society and the Black church as systemic and institutional perpetrators that condemn and ultimately suck the life out of Black women in their struggle for wholeness. In efforts to lift the veil, to reveal the hidden figures, that is, Black women's participation in shaping the soul of Black liberation, womanist theology offers a corrective to the Black church and Black theology in its quest to expand the Black liberative imagination to value every body. Black sociologist W.B. Du Bois, in his timeless classic 1903, The Souls of Black Folk, analyzes the spiritual and philosophical dimensions of Black life in America. Du Bois names the enduring problem in the 20th century as the color line, asking how does it feel to be a problem, or why does God make me an outcast and a stranger in my own house? Du Bois characterizes the veil as a metaphor to describe the spiritual strivings and social stance of the Black community trapped by the penetrating white gaze. And he articulates the Black experience as this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others or measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. On one end, the veil symbolizes a guise that inhibits one's ability to both see and be seen fully. The veil casts a shadow that covers the true identity of the concealed. Such a shadow produces contempt and shame for the looked upon in efforts to be both understood and recognized, which marks the condition of African Americans as between two worlds within the veil and living in the valley of the shadow of the death. On the other, children born with a veil, an incaul or encased in a thin membrane from the amniotic sac, usually over their face or eyes, bore witness to the gift of second sight, or the prophetic and psychic insight into Black folklore that marked a sign of a special destiny. Such a gift endows Black consciousness with the ability to not pass easily into the chasm of whiteness, but to turn away from the white gaze and create counterworlds of being and becoming that move the shadow of death to new life. Du Bois analyzed the Negro church of the Reconstruction period by identifying its shortcomings behind the veil, wrestling with its two-ness. The Negro church, as Du Bois described, existed as a social center of Negro life, the most characteristic expression of African character, and a real conserver of morals, a straightener of family life, and the final authority of what is good and right. However, the social forces of the Negro problem, or the double life, fostered a peculiar wrenching of the soul that corrupted the Black religious life and shifted the Negro church from loving communities of shared faith to groups of cold, fashionable devotees in no way distinguishable from similar white groups save in color of skin, and into large social and businesses, institutions catering to the desire for information and amusement of their members, warily avoiding unpleasant questions both within and without the Black world. For Du Bois, intracommunal strife, gender conflict, religious escapism, and white imitation has stood at the center of the corruption of the turn of the century Negro church. Thus, the Negro church, as missing the guiding star of the past, and is continually or perpetually searching in the great night for a new religious ideal. In the mid-20th century, James Cone's reclamation of Black human dignity, somebodyness, and Black theological constructions confronted the duplicity of white Christianity and articulated the need for the church to be converted to the God of liberation who identifies through the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith with the conditions of oppressed people. For Cone, the white church that has perpetuated the denigration of Black humanity throughout history must answer to the question, what must I do to be saved? Building upon Du Bois, Cone posited that the 20th century Black church must also face a conversion from white control and beliefs that have often disempowered Black people. Cone argues if the Black church, quote, organizations want to remain faithful to the New Testament gospel and to the great tradition of the pre-Civil War, they must relinquish their stake in the status quo and the values in white society by identifying exclusively with Black power as the only hope for the Black church. The Black church, in Cone's view, held greater responsibility beyond a place of gathering to affirm Black existence, but to be Christian. The Black church needed to interrogate its white social structures that it has accepted in order to oppress black people. Thus, the black church cannot be absolved from political responsibility to resist the dominant powers in its elevation of somebodyness in black identity. Cone recognized that the dissension between denominational and local black churches on the question of political liberation signaled that few black churches have held an institutional commitment to organized church life and work for the creation of freedom. After his own theological conversion prompted by his womanist students, Cone labeled sexism as a vestige of the lingering imprint of the white church on the black church. Cone appeals to his black male theologians and church leaders. Quote, "I firmly believe that the black church cannot regain its Christian integrity unless it is willing to face head on the evil of patriarchy and seek to eliminate it." End quote. The failure of the black church to confront its sexism and patriarchy undermines any Christian claim to the gospel of liberation and participation of liberation of the black community. It is, as Senator Raphael Warnock maintains, the divided mind of the black church that perpetuates devastating consequences for black women both within and outside. Black women's political organizing bears its roots in the black church as black women continue to fight to receive full rights as members within an institution they helped to birth and sustain. Even while born as a movement of resistance to confront bodily injustice and nurture the souls of black people, womanist ethicist Ebony Marshall Terman contends the problem of the black church is incarnational, which points to the soul-snatching and body-denying practices that divinely ordain mostly men to lead and govern behind the veil. Thus, in efforts to make men and to save bodies motivated by an impulse of the social gospel, Terman critiques the mostly male managers of the black church who uphold the very oppression that the black church seeks to resist toward black church women and other differentiated bodies. In other words, the intracommunal oppression within the black church and the voyeurism of black church women's bodies and souls harbor similar characteristics of the white supremacist gaze that frames blackness as non or subhuman and places the black community in contempt. Terman calls us to lift the veil and move beyond the guise of liberation that leaves some bodies out of the scope of transformation, and rather turn to black women as the incarnate image of God in the world, the same substance of God as to his humanity. Thus, black women exist as the primary resource for resisting injustice and reconstituting the body and soul of the black church. While the starting point of black women's political agency begins in the black church, they are often missing from the narratives of the spiritual and political witness and prophetic witness of the black church. Its race to freedom as the public proclamation of solely black men ignores black women's contributions and distorts its vision of freedom and liberation for the black community. Black women redeeming the soul of America and the black church points to a reclaiming of a vision of liberation that includes everybody and the perquisites of somebodyness for everybody. However, the black church's adoption of white power structures and white evangelical interpretive traditions that reinforce the subordination of women as a revelation of the Christian faith has distorted its central mission to the business of saving black women. Black women occupying majority status in the black church does not equate to shared leadership or full recognition as primary stakeholders in decision-making or power brokers in the development of the institutions that they sustain. Most black male clergy understand that one of the most essential ministries of the black church is black women because of their population and size. However, more would invest in ministering to black church women only to magnify their platforms, popularity, socio-political influence, and spiritual capital. The hyper-obsessive occupation of black churches to turn its gaze toward black women functions as misrecognition that witnesses the struggle and pain of black women as entry points to not minister to, but to manipulate, monetize, monopolize black women's suffering. In this sense, black women are perhaps the biggest consumer and commodity of the black church, even to their detriment. There are numerous examples in priestly and prophetic circles of black churches. One popular example is the commodification of black women's pain in Bishop T.D. Jakes' and the Woman Thou Art Loose movement. In his million-copy bestseller, Woman Thou Art Loose, first published in 1993, Jakes characterizes Luke 13 and his reading of the infirmed woman into three categories: the person, the problem, and the prescription. Jakes frames this Lucan woman as the problem with a moral infirmity, a physical or mental weakness that needs loosening or saving by Jesus, with little to no attention addressing the forces that cause her condition. Jakes writes, quote, "The woman's dilemma is her own, but perhaps you will find some point of relativity between her case history and your own. She could be like someone you know or have known. She could be like you," end quote. Jakes acknowledges that the woman is unable to stand up straight, but never addresses her bendedness. In fact, Jakes does not use the word bent in his analysis at all, but only infirmity and crippling condition. Jakes parallels this woman with the experiences of contemporary black women to form the central thesis of the WTAL movement that ascribes black women as bound by their wrongdoing, not the wrong done to black women by oppressive systems that is revealed through their bendedness. Seemingly, black women are blamed and shamed for oppression they endure while being charged to act as agents to save themselves through faithfulness to Jesus. Jakes scripts black women in a perpetual state of contempt, bent by their moral and spiritual failures. Jakes' reading, however, is incomplete because Jakes fails to finish the pericope in Luke 13, 14, and 17, when Jesus heals the woman but also confronts the hypocrisy of the very society and religious community that bent the woman double. Thus, Jakes misses the true Christian mission, and Jesus is charged to speak against the oppressive conditions that seize the most vulnerable. For more than 25 years, the WTAL brand successfully sustained a crooked ideology that black women are the problem, while simultaneously casting a vision for black women's empowerment that eclipsed the call to the black church and its leaders to follow Jesus and confront the powers that wound. I think it is important to locate Jakes as not an anomaly, but at the height of the black church tradition, wherein black pastors and leaders prescribe jaded Christian doctrine to black church women Sunday after Sunday. Jake rises to the top of the black church culture as what Tamora Lomax describes as the ne plus ultra of black preaching, but does so undeniably on the backs of black women. According to womanist scholar Paula McGee, Jake Jakes blends the sacred and secular dimensions of pastor and entrepreneur. He has successfully branded himself as a liberator of women. Women believe that Jakes is just like Jesus, when according to the Gospel of Luke, he healed the infirmed woman with the words, "Woman, thou art loose." And Jakes has successfully convinced women all over the world that they need to be loosed, and they need to be loosed by him. However, Jakes, the archetype, is paradigmatic of the larger corruption within the moral fabric of the contemporary black church. This ain't a hate on Jakes. It's a recognition that from Jakes to Tyler Perry to Jamal Bryant's, these hoes ain't loyal, to Chris Davis, you can't turn a hoe into a housewife, to Keon Henderson's silencing of crying black women in worship, to Terry Jackson's call for the young teenage mother to apologize to the church just earlier this year in Hampton, Virginia. These examples and countless more uncover a pervasive moral dilemma within the black church that twists the gospel to maintain its relevance at the expense of sacrificing black women. From the popular to the prophetic, black feminist and womanist ethicist Carrie's Day, Unfinished Business, exposes ways even socially conscious black churches participate in the misrecognition of poor black women. The linkage of oppressive systems that black women did not create, but must survive, like poverty, to an individual moral failure or perhaps a spiritual failure of black women, and the minds and hearts of some black churches perpetuates the mischaracterization of black women's moral agency and situates black women not only in a crooked room, but up against what I name as a crooked gospel. I draw from Melissa Harris Perry, political scientist Melissa Harris Perry, her philosophical notion of black women existing in a crooked room where black women's agency is distorted to unmask the black church obsession, with the saving of black women as a distortion of the gospel of liberation. Harris Perry sees womanism as the religious academies attempt to straighten the crooked room by offering black women positive visions of themselves as citizens. However, Harris Perry is critical of the sourcing of the term womanist in the second part of the definition as traditionally capable. In Harris Perry's view, such a marker of capability carries an undue burden of strength for black women to save themselves and community. She critiques two significant methods of womanism in the religious academy. First, she's critical of the Christian leanings of womanist religious thought, which falls apart as a growing body of womanist religious scholars continue to develop works in religious traditions outside of Christianity, including Islam, Buddhism, and African derived religions. Harris Perry further critiques the womanist divine imagination that womanist theologians and ethicists, in her view, espouse, which call for black women to reimagine their identities beyond cultural stereotypes and nurture an inner divine or incarnational strength to enliven a more just ordering of the world. Harris Perry argues in a quest to establish a sacred imagination beyond a white savior and male savior. For Perry, the womanist theological enterprise falls short if its image of God maintains that black women must become like God. She contends, quote, "Perhaps womanist perspectives are simply another crooked image that encourages black women to take on yet another role of responsibility for others. Perhaps as they imagine God, who is like them, they see themselves as more like God, and although that imagining can bolster self-esteem, it might also encourage a level of sacrifice that is beyond what should be expected of a mere mortal." While Harris Perry rightly names womanist theology as a prophetic response to the separate and unequal status of black women in the black church, I critique Harris Perry for misinterpreting womanist theological vision as an undue burden for black women to save ourselves and ultimately become God. In contradistinction, Harris Perry's critique of the womanist divine imagination misrecognizes womanist theology and ethics on the matter of salvation. Affirmation of black women's humanity as being made in the image of God is in no way an effort or a proposal to suggest that black women should be God. Neither is it an attempt to encourage black women to take on the burdens of surrogacy, sacrifice, or strength in order to save a nation or community. Womanist articulations of black women's participation in the work of salvation is descriptive at best. Whereas liberation is the goal, womanist theologian Dolores Williams explicitly identifies the long range of black women's quest for salvation as survival, as we see in the narrative of Hagar. Thus, black women's adoption of a radical humanism to survive is not a manner of wanting to bear the weight of salvation, but an awareness that black women simply cannot wait for another and must work with God as agents and partners with God on the journey. Black women working with the divine holds promise that black women will not suffer these yokes alone. From these womanist constructions of salvation, I identify the promise of black women's mutual liberation and co-partnership with God in the crosshairs of political and theological damages by 5 pillars. This notion that salvation for black women begins with a quest for wholeness. Salvation for black women requires transformation of self and society. Salvation for black women advocates for communal redemption. Salvation for black women necessitates a realized eschatology in this world, in this time now. The salvation of black women fosters co-partnership between God and black women. The arc, the moral universe, is long, but it bends towards justice. Martin Luther King Jr. riffs a concept of American transcendentalist Theodore Parker, his notion that the moral universe bends towards justice. It is that final speech, "I've been to the mountaintop," where King spoke these words: "Let's rise up with a greater readiness. Let's stand with a greater determination, and let us move in these powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be." We have an opportunity to make not America great again, but a better nation in the first place. It is Coretta Scott King that clinged to this vision, because the salvation of America cannot be the burden of black women alone. In fact, to place such a mantle on black women is ultimately to reinscribe our surrogacy. Black women ought not be the cleanup crew for America's numerous injustice. We ought not be seen as merely political surrogates to repair the breach and restore the streets of despair of a death-dealing administration. The salvific potential within black women does not preclude the divine. A womanist reckoning with the existential reality that our saviors are ourselves does not affirm that black women must bear the burden of a crooked world alone. As Luke 13 narrates, a liberating God through Jesus Christ, who recognizes black women's bodies and agencies and works with us in efforts towards wholeness, the story of my grandmother further illuminates black women remaining faithful to the very end of their struggles, and the enduring need of human agency and divine power to realize their salvation. Black women have always known our saviors are ourselves, but this salvation for black women is never just for black women alone. This is why Harriet Tubman walked to Canada for herself and her people on numerous occasions, without a map or a trail, but with the Spirit as a divine compass. If we are honest, any quest to redeem the soul of America is linked to the bodies and lives of black women. Perhaps the lesson for tonight is to follow black women, or at least make way for black women as we work with God to struggle for wholeness, to advocate for suffering communities, to transform selves and this world as it is known, not in the sweet by and by, but in the here and now, and by extension, do the work of saving America and redeeming the soul of the black church again and again. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you for a very compelling presentation. I am going to invite Mrs. Katrina Murphy. She is soon to graduate from our school, MDiv candidate. And she also participates in my seminar in Womanist Ethics and Theology. She's going to come now and give us a response.
Good evening and welcome, everyone. To Reverend Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles, we are so thankful for your presence here tonight and for accepting the invitation to be our guest lecturer and sharing your knowledge and insights with us. We have been greatly enriched by your lecture. It has encouraged us to think more critically about the many ways Black women's bodies have been bent in our society. In your book, you highlight the many ways Black women confront a crooked gospel and how this burden manifests in our bodies. Your research, along with your work as the director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership, has provided us with a path forward as we teach biblical truth in both the church and the academy. So before I ask my question, I just want to say thank you for how you have honored the womanist scholars that paved the way for us and for how you are continuing their legacy. As a result of reading your book and hearing the lecture tonight, I'm wondering if you could offer advice for those of us who are about to graduate and find ourselves bent between the academy and the church, and how to use womanist ethics and biblical interpretation to help empower those bearing the weight of oppressive structures within our churches. You have shared some hard truths tonight, some hard truths. And as daughters of the church, how can we walk the talk in a crooked room?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think I want to borrow from the Womanist canon when Katie Geneva Cannon says, do the work your soul must have. And I think that is particularly insightful for this conversation on navigating between the academy and the church. One of the things that I try to articulate in this work is that womanism loses its prophetic edge if we are not engaging the congregants, folks in churches that are ultimately hearing these kinds of sermons and theological positions Sunday after Sunday and need to be introduced to more liberative visions. I think we do a disservice when this work is only relevant for academicians. If we are only speaking to ourselves, where's the value for the folk who really need it? I take pride that much of this book was written at the kitchen table of my advisor, Dr. Joanne Terrell. And from the kitchen table to the public square, there is necessary conversation that must happen in our community with our folk that we have to be able to translate. We do the work as womanists. It's multi-dialogical, which means we translate, we transfer, we transliterate. We are constantly working as mediators between these communities. And as Renita Weems often tells us, the academy and the church are jealous lovers. That they may put us in sticky situations, but somebody has to be in the mess in order for there to be real transformation. So I guess my call is to do the work your soul must have, to do the difficult work of trying to have these conversations in multiple spaces. If you can craft an academic paper, it also can be a sermon. It also needs to be translated into a Bible study. It also could be relevant for a podcast. How can we continue to turn these same critical questions that we have to multiple different communities so that all of us can ultimately be transformed?
Well, we're going to invite our audience, if you have questions that you would like to direct to our lecturer. I said questions. We've heard the lecture, so we don't need to hear any more lectures this evening. But if you would like to, and we really do want to engage in conversation though. And so if anyone has a question, or you can offer a comment if you like. It doesn't have to be a question, but the floor is open. I don't know, do we have another microphone? No? Okay, so if you would just stand, if you would, and identify yourself, and if necessary, we'll just have you repeat the question so that our streaming audience will be able to hear. All right, while you're deciding about your questions, I will ask a question. And this is a softball. I am very intrigued by how your text, your book, is centered on the life of your grandmother. And you take her life in context, and that becomes an important context for the ethical and theological reflection, and also for your biblical hermeneutic. It's based on your assessment of her life. What I would ask is, how does your referencing of your grandmother's impact in your work compare with what Dr. Yolanda Pierce has done in her book? It strikes me that your books are very different, but for both of you, the life of your grandmother is important. So that was the question I wanted to ask, because I'm wondering if we're going to see more womanist scholars follow that same trajectory going forward. But I just would like to hear how you see your text in comparison to hers.
That's a great question, Dr. Sanders.
It was a softball.
It is. So I think earlier generations, prioritize the kind of perspectives and voices of what we would call Black exceptional women. So writings about Ida B. Wells Barnett as an anti-lynching activist, or about women like Mary Church Terrell, or Nannie Helen Burroughs, or Pauli Murray, or others. And they offer and cast visions that we should continue to engage, that I think are insightful. I think one of the calls that we have to contemporary womanist scholars is how might we resource the voices of everyday Black women. I think Emily Towns has invited us to think about that in her work, Womanist Ethics in the Cultural Production of Evil, in terms of attending to the everydayness. We understand these exceptional Black women who have made strides in our world and transformed, but what about those who don't have, right, the schools or the churches or the spaces that are named in their honor? Where are those stories? And for that reason, a story like my grandmother is one that I want us to recover. As a hidden figure, nothing in most people's minds are exceptional, but certainly her story is powerful. And those kinds of stories are able, as we extract from them, we're able to do deep, theological, critical, careful, ethical work in assessing and engaging their experiences with our traditions, right? So I think part of the interest is to say the exceptional women, I'm writing on an exceptional woman now, Katie Geneva Cannon, are good. But we also need some everyday women, some folks whose stories are missing, right? Some folks whose stories that won't likely be told, right? The other thing in relation to Dr. Pierce's work, which I also am such a fan of, I think she invites us to do what she calls grandmother theology, that really the way forward, the future of the womanist traditions is actually a return in terms of Sankofa, to look back at the stories of the women who have shaped our history as we go forward, right? So when folks ask me, what's the future of womanism? I'm like, where are you looking at historically? Because you need those stories in the past that can give us guidance about what to do next. Often when we face challenges in our world, we think there's something new under the sun. But rather, if we begin to trace these stories, we'll find that no, they've left us some breadcrumbs on the way. And all we need, like Hansel and Gretel, the Black version, is to find those crumbs and ultimately create the meal that will ultimately feed ourselves and our kin.
All right, you stay. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Ford.
Thank you.
Well, I want to stand up here because this segue to my question. I grew up and I was so close to my maternal and paternal grandparents. And this book really took me on the emotional roller coaster because my grandmother was a first lady for 36 years, but she also was a domestic. And she used to take me to work with her often. I was 7, 8 years old, and this is in Texas 40 plus years ago. And I've always enjoyed that because the house we used to go to had travel, had all this stuff. But your book caused me to look through that whole story with a different lens. And I wish my grandmother was still living so I could get the real story of how she felt about being a domestic. One thing that jumped out to me is when we used to go there, we was big close friends with the family until recently, actually. We're still close to that family. I remember when we used to go there, sometimes the parents wouldn't be in the house, but one of the children would be there, who was a little older than me, so probably a teenager. And this children was very respectful of my grandmother, but she could actually tell my grandmother the work that needed to be done when the parents were gone. And I just thought about this, looking through it from a different lens, like how did my grandmother really feel as a first lady in their very prominent church? So we very respected, and then going into this domestic area. So just for you, talk about the emotions of this, because I had pause when reading the book. It really just kind of revisited the way I thought about it. And now, through this new lived experience, you know, how did my grandmother really feel about that? And what lens, when did it change in the lens that you kind of view that domestic aspect of it?
Yeah, so for folks who are online, my brother here, what's your name? Carl?
Carl Byrne.
Carl. So he asked a question about, talk a little bit about my experiences or understanding or shaping of my grandmother's emotions in terms of living as a domestic and what that meant for her at that particular time. I think there's so much resonance between our stories. When you talked about your grandmother picking you up, I remember my grandmother got 1 or 2 days off from work, and she would make it a point. Actually, I was cared for by both of my grandmothers. So when my maternal grandmother couldn't pick me up after work or pick me up on days she was off. My paternal grandmother was my caretaker when I was very young. But then when my maternal grandmother was able to take off work, she would plan the whole day centered on how to make my life wonderful. From early morning breakfast to the stories, to grilled cheese sandwiches, to dinner. I mean, it was a whole thing. So one of the things that I love about her story is that she never complained. And that is not to say she was not suffering, but to recognize that she understood not only the challenges that she was facing, but also a deep recognition that she was relying on the support of God to help her through the journey. Part of what I'm trying to articulate in the book is not only her experience as a domestic and ultimately as a housekeeper in Chicago, but that this story parallels to the ways Black women have been scripted in media, right? As only these mammy figures, or figures that are seen as to clean up political messes in like Scandal and other fantastic kind of imaginations of Black women as perpetually a kind of domestic servant. So it's important for us to move beyond even just locating the experience of domestics, but see how has American society and ultimately the Black church, in its interest to keep Black women in the backbone, to do all the work and never get the praise, to work behind the scenes and never get the recognition, participate in domesticizing or domesticating Black women that we continually to see in today's world. And yet, there's a part of the book that says, and we are not yet saved. This work of salvation is past, present, and its future. It's a recognition that we have to return to the question of salvation over and over again, that the same people who will wake up December 2017 and say Black women saved America again are the same people that won't cast their vote for the best candidate who is a Black woman to ultimately lead our world, right, our nation to a better outcome. It's double-sided, it's crooked, it's twisted. How could we value but not value? How could we recognize but also not recognize or misrecognize? These are the double ways by which we've constantly been forced to live and ultimately find a way to see ourselves beyond these distortions and contortions.
Okay. In the back, another question.
Hey, thank you for sharing. My name is Devin. I'm here at Divinity. Can you please share a little bit about how the church can avoid the web of quote-unquote salvation that Dr. feel like the salvation is kind of offered? Because I found that it's very easy to get into the context of churching, the culture of churching, and keep the things going just because our predecessor did or our father, mother, ministry, whatever. How do we break that cycle as the next leaders of our churches or in all of our context to ensure that we avoid some of the experiences that you have communicated in your book and also your lecture today?
Yeah, I think reading the second half of that Luke 13, that part of what Jesus does is not just a healing, but it's a confrontation. And if we are, as a Black church, I'm a daughter of the tradition, right? I'm not saying let's leave the Black church behind. I'm saying because I love the Black church so much, and because it is the faith of my grandmother, right, that I'm calling the church to be better than it is and has been, which requires that we call out and confront these crooked systems. Why are all the people who give the most sitting in the front and everybody else in the back, right? Why are we not allowing these voices of the people who are actually working the hardest to not be recognized? Where is the space by which we will think about the minoritized populations, whether it's women, whether it is queer perspectives or queer persons, wherever, right? Why aren't we thinking about ways in which these voices are often silenced by our traditions? I think if we are prophetic in that way, by calling out and confronting these systems, we're doing the work that Jesus did, which is thinking about a radical social orientation, a vision of liberation that includes all of us. If there is a vision of Black liberation that does not include Black women, that does not include Black queer persons, that does not include Black children, then it doesn't include all of us. So we need to contest any vision, any offering that the Black church offers that will maintain these visions that ultimately don't support the inclusion of everybody.
Other questions, comments? Any other questions? All right, I guess I'll have another question. Got a chance? All right. Can you say a little bit more about T.D. Jakes? Especially from the perspective of, well, has your perspective changed in the few months since your book has been published? You feeling me?
Yeah, I feel you. So, one of the things, when I talk about T.D. Jakes' reading of that particular passage, one of the things I hopefully try to articulate is that T.D. Jakes is not the only, or this is not a move for prophetic Black church or folks who are more socially justice-minded to say, look at T.D. Jakes and look at the wrong he's doing. It's to say, no, if T.D. Jakes is on a mega, massive scale, then he's giving us a way or a glimpse of what's happening at many of these smaller churches Sunday after Sunday. He gets casted, or he becomes a particular example because of the way in which his movement has been mass-produced. But this is not to say that I am not indicting the ways that very small churches with 2 or 3 members are still perpetuating very crooked theologies and ideologies that ultimately at Black women's expense, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to articulate as well is that one of the challenges of these kind of theologies is that what the Black church does understand is that the witness of Black women in Black churches is important, is deeply significant. My problem is when the Black church has twisted its mission towards saving Black women, that is ultimately commodified, that is mass-produced. Everybody got a women's conference, but everybody has this and that, but they are not actually committed to doing the work of attending to the political and theological damages that impact Black women every day. I mean, where are y'all at on the reproductive justice issue? I mean, where are the churches at, right? When we talk about real social political consequences that face Black women, often not included in the numbers, or in the case of Black Lives Matter or other social movements led by Black women, often paralleling or making up their own kind of justice movements in order to counter traditions or social movements that are led by Black women, right? So in this sense, right, I'm saying there is some work to do, not in pointing our finger to say this one is bad and we're not, but to say in many ways, we're like them. That when we begin to look at the ways in which we interpret Scripture, there are more Jakeses in our pulpits than there are the liberative voices that we see. So this is not to shame Jakes as this kind of bully pulpit, as Teresa Smallwood would call it, figure, but to say, find the ways in which you too have interpreted Scripture at Black women's expense.
Dr. Jones Quarles, thank you. Yeah, this is amazing. Thank you. Let me see if I can formulate the question. Maybe I'll just think about it in this way. How might we think of other texts in relation to the one that you're focusing this lecture on as liberative passages for Black women. Are there others that you might point to that might speak in a similar way?
Yeah. Just the whole Bible. Most notably, I think Dolores Williams has done the work in terms of crafting a vision for us in terms of the narrative of Hagar and paralleling. I really see my work as a kind of New Testament version of Hagar in some ways by providing us with another account of a woman who is displaced or not recognized and who ultimately needs God or the help of God on her side for survival and liberation. One of the things I think is, or one of the passages that I also want to call our attention to is that damsel girl in Acts 16. Often when folks try to suggest that she's of evil sight or spirit, no, she's a truth teller. Telling exactly what she knows who these people are, and yet she is trafficked, right? By folks who find more value in what she can produce than her, than who she is in herself, right? And so before we begin to read texts claiming Mary Magdalene is the woman with 7 demons, and this one is the one who, was caught in the act of adultery, right? All of these ways in which we began to point fingers at women and script them in certain lights. Wife, she looked bad, right? Is there some virtue there that we're misrecognizing? Is there a way by which the text is narrating this woman's a role and her agency and her activity, and we're misreading what actually is virtuous, and we're calling it vicious, right? So I would be perhaps not a text, but I would just invite us to a hermeneutic of skepticism and suspicion. That any text that suggests that the woman is evil, bad, just look at it differently. Perhaps, how would you read this text if that wasn't the case? If she was valued in her community, if we did know her name, help me out, Gina Stewart, Claudia, right? Right. Well, how would we change not only our orientation to the text, but also how would we preach these texts, right? If we didn't read them the way we've always been reading, suggesting that these are the fallen women, right? And these are the glorious or the mighty valor or men of the text, right? So it's just a suspicion, a skepticism that I'm inviting us to look at many of these texts and question what is really virtuous about these women and what are they teaching us that perhaps we've been trained to not see.
All right. Thank you. Let's once again express our appreciation for our lecturer. This has been a rich conversation and presentation. Up against a crooked gospel, as soon as we're dismissed, I invite you to go right outside where we have a reception. We have a table where you can get the book and have your book signed, and I would encourage everyone to get Up Against a Crooked Gospel, Black Women's Bodies and the Politics of Redemption. And so what I'm going to do is offer a brief prayer of dismissal and a blessing, and then let's allow our lecturer to make her way to the book table, and then we'll have more sharing and conversation there. God, we are so grateful for the gifts of intellect and the gifts of spirit and the gifts of performance, of oration, the gift of preaching and public speaking and public testimony that you have embedded in our community, but especially in your servant who has lectured to us from her work, from her life, from her heart, and from her mind. Thank you, God, for our conversation as we continue with your blessing on the refreshments that have been provided for us. We ask, God, that you will provide for Dr. Melanie Jones Quarles good success in her academic work, in her leadership of the Womanist Center there in Richmond. And also we ask God your blessing upon this book, this volume, that it will produce the fruit of continued questions and critique of our churches, of our families, of our relationships, of ourselves. And we just are very confident, God, that as we pray, we're praying according to your will. And so we ask your blessing on us as a community of teachers and learners, a community of reflection. And we pray, God, that your peace and that your truth and that your justice will be our pathway and our guide. In your name we pray, amen. Thanks so much for being here, and let's convene at the book table and share in the refreshments.
Might we also give Dr. Sanders a hand for her leadership tonight? Thank you.